So now we're going to prep your narrative, and this is one of the best things that you can do to stay organized from the get-go. You're basically giving the whole structure of your application a skeleton, and this makes it just a lot easier to start populating and moving quickly and making sure that you're answering the questions in a way that meets the scoring criteria. So even if you're submitting an online application form, I always like to start it in a Word document. It just makes it a lot easier to move that information over into the online form, easier to edit and share, and then easier to catch mistakes because often those online forms won't have a spell check. So in almost all instances, the grant guideline is going to tell you exactly what needs to be completed and what they're looking for. We're going to type that information from the grant guideline directly into the Word document. It can be a little boring and seem kind of redundant to do this as you're literally just spending time typing out the entire grant guidelines essentially, but it's a really good mental exercise and process to start really thinking, how am I going to respond to this question and what sort of information do I need to go collect to do so? Some grant guidelines make it really clear how they're going to evaluate each question and how they're going to rate you. These are my favorite because then you know exactly what to do to make the response strong. And if that's the case, we're also going to populate that information right below the grant question. You'll find sometimes what they evaluate you on differs a little bit from what the question's asking. So it's really important to have those two bits of information side by side and making sure that we're answering the question, but also maximizing our likelihood of actually getting the maximum points for that section. When you're putting your narrative template together, you also want to include maximum word counts, and this can be an area that'll be tricky. So if it says 1,500 characters maximum response, well, is that including spaces or not? And it really is unfortunate when you drop in the text that you've already finalized and it's ready to go and you're putting it into the application form to submit and realize, oh, they mean plus spacing characters, and therefore I'm way over on my word count and you're scrambling to cut text at the last minute. Not a good situation. So it's good to have that. Also because if it can be really easy to kind of go overboard and think you're responding to a question, but all of a sudden you've put in 6 times more content than you actually have the room to respond in. And while I'm a big proponent for having at least 20% more text in the response in your first draft, because you will fine tune it, you will cut it down. If you've spent all of this time writing a huge response and it has to get cut because they only want a paragraph, well, that's a waste of time. So we like to know how much text are we allowed to use and being kind of in that ballpark while we're writing. As I'm sure most of you know, in the lower left-hand corner of Word, you can look at the word count, and then if you click on that, you can also pop up how many characters, including with spaces and not, are being used. So if they're not going to provide character limits, one of the best ways you can determine how large a section should be is dividing the amount of points that you're going to get for that section with the total page limit. And so I'm going to share an example to explain this. Here is an EPA competitive grant from the National Wetland Program. So I've downloaded the funding announcement. I press Control F to access the Find feature, and I'm locating the page limit. So it says it's 10 pages single-spaced or 20 pages double-spaced. Anything over will be discarded. I'm then going to locate the selection criteria. So the highest criteria is being able to demonstrate that our project fits the national priority area defined in section 1B, and it's worth 25 points. So I know that I actually only have 9 pages to work with in this application because they said the cover page is actually included in the total page count. So if I divide 9 pages by 100 points, the total points allowed, I'll get 0.09. And then I multiply that by 25 points for this first section, and I'll know that, okay, being able to respond to how the project relates to the national priority area should be roughly 2.25 pages. Environmental results and measuring progress would again be the 0.09 times 20 points, so it needs to be about 1.8 pages long, and so on. 500 words typically fit onto a single space page, but that does depend a lot on how creative you are with font selection. I do not go below size 11. It just gets to be too hard for your reviewers to read that. So now that you have all of this information into your narrative template, start to use bullet points to list ideas for what can go into this response. And this can help prompt discussion with your team members on what needs done, by when, and by whom. Basically, your life gets a lot easier in responding to the different narrative sections if you know what kind of information you want to put in there, and you can go ahead and start collecting that and getting it into your resource folder. So now that you have all of this information in a narrative template and you've really thought through, okay, what do I need to ask my team to do? How do I want to start responding to this? What questions do we still have? This is now time to go launch your kickoff meeting. And when basically your team gets together, you are going to run a meeting to collect the missing pieces of data you need to start writing your narrative.